Welcome to the Tuesday Masterclasses with Fortuna. As many of you will be aware, every Tuesday we take a deep dive into one of the world's top business schools. And earlier in May, we took a close look at the Harvard Business School. Last week, it was Wharton. Both of those, they were fantastic webinars with my colleagues. They're available on YouTube. And of course, now it's time to change lives, change organizations, and change the world with changing coasts on the West Coast to talk about the Stanford GSB. And as any of you that have followed these webinars will be aware, we're looking at the school, its culture, and then all of the components that come together for the application to the most selective business school. I'm going to estimate, normally Stanford will receive anywhere between 7,500 and a little over 8,000 applications for just 417 places. So you don't need GMAT skills to do the calculation on that one. This is the most selective full-time MBA program in the world, which is why I'm delighted that we're bringing together so much insider expertise from my colleagues at Fortuna to look at the school and the admissions process. So I do encourage you to reach out to all of us, as I talked about feeling blessed to work at Fortuna with this incredible team that we've pulled together over the last 10 years from the top US and European business schools. Now, of course, as we look at all of those different components, sharing your story and what matters most to you, it's very personal. It's your story. It's the unique footprints, as Kirsten Moss likes to describe it, that you have left. So, of course, beyond this webinar, we encourage you to reach out to us and share that story, and we can talk about all of the many things that you will be able to leverage as you put together applications for the year ahead. So just log on to the Fortuna website and sign up for one of the free consultations. I talked about insider expertise. Let me give you a wonderful sense of that. Rachel Erickson Hee, we're not allowed to talk about football on this webinar, but we agree to disagree. But what I do know is that Rachel brings all of the expertise, both as a Stanford alum and also former GSB interviewer at the school. And with her former classmate, Tatiana, who's also a GSB alum and GSB interviewer, these two actually were in the class with Derek Bolton. Derek was the previous Associate Dean and Director of Admissions at Stanford, who came up with this iconic question that the school has asked for the last 18 years about what matters most to you and why. Judith, our co-director last week, said, oh, we were so jealous of Stanford of having such a great question. And it's a question that Silpa Sharma is very familiar with, having been an admissions file reader at Stanford GSB. She's also a Cornell MBA. So thank you to the three of you for joining us. And I know a very full and engaging session. We encourage individuals to share their questions. The only issue with that is me keeping up with all of the great questions that they ask. Some of them I will try to slide into the conversation as we go, and then perhaps at the end we'll wrap up, and a bit like a quiz show, I'll put some of those questions to each of you. Again, as a part of a weekly series, to remind you, of course, that in the Tuesdays that lie ahead in the rest of May, and then as we move into June, it corresponds with schools that are now publishing their applications, the deadlines for the year ahead. So in the coming weeks, we'll be looking at Columbia Business School, Chicago Booth, Kellogg, MIT Sloan, INSEAD, London Business School. Then we'll move into the S7, other fantastic schools like Berkeley Haas, Yale SOM, Duke, Fuqua, and others. So we hope that you really have made this time on a Tuesday part of your diary. Today, as I said, it's all about the GSB. So of course, I guess a place to start is what is so unique about this remarkable business school. And I'm going to get Rachel to share a few of her thoughts on the school.
Sure. So obviously the first thing that comes to mind when you hear Stanford Business School is Silicon Valley, both because of Stanford's ties to that community and Stanford Business School's ties to that community. And this has really shown itself at the business school in three key areas, in technology, in venture capital, and entrepreneurship. And because of the wealth of resources and the wealth of connections, it means that the professors have just an incredible number of courses that they teach in these areas. They've done fantastic research in these areas. And then it also means that from the student perspective, these three areas are ones where you will have the CEO of Intel co-teach a class at Stanford. He did for many years. Or you will have a guest venture capitalist drop by to discuss why they invested in a class that you may have been studying a case about. And it also means that you have a lot of real world projects that may be working with some of these companies. And of course, it gives you access to a fantastic network, not just while you're at school, but then also after graduation. So Stanford's expertise in those three areas, I think, is, obviously something that everybody knows about. And I would say it's really well deserved. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is that Stanford is not just a technology school, and it's not just a startup school. And particularly when you talk about entrepreneurship, for Stanford, they don't see that as a skill that is just for startups. They see that actually as a core skill for general managers and for general management. And they believe that whether you're at a big company or a nonprofit or a government or public policy, that the skills that you learn in entrepreneurship are actually really about knowing how to create a culture of innovation. And that this is something that being able to innovate and being able to cope with innovation will leave you prepared when you're in an environment where things are changing, and will also give you the skills to become one of the people that is driving that change. So even if you are somebody who hates technology and wants nothing to do with startups, those things that you're going to learn at Stanford in those courses, if you decide to take them, are going to be much more generally applicable to the world of business and really becoming a leader in society in general. So related to that, there's another area that Stanford is also particularly famous for, and that is their Center for Social Innovation, which works on issues of social impact and sustainability. And Stanford is actually the first business school to have started a Center for Social Innovation, and this model has now been copied. There's even a Center for Social Innovation at the White House, to give you an idea of how widespread this has become. And this gives, if you are someone who is interested in these areas and you go to Stanford, once again, you have these incredible resources at your fingertip. The professors and the community and the network can just allow you to really dive into this area. And you can even graduate with a certificate in public management from Stanford. So those are some of the things that Stanford is particularly famous for that you think of when you hear the name Stanford GSB.
The first thing I think about, Rachel, is the weather. I must have got it all wrong. But no, it's true, an idyllic spot. As you talk about, this sort of multidisciplinary, and there's so much that's going on. Other schools, whether it's Sloan and its relationship with MIT, we often think about the business school and its relationship with the wider institution. And that's part of the reality too, right? Whether it's the D School, computer science, I mean, there are tremendous opportunities for cross-pollination beyond the borders of the GSB.
Yes, and that's, I think, one of the other things that's really special about Stanford. More than 71% of students, I believe, graduate who have taken at least one class across the street, as they call it, at one of the other schools or divisions at Stanford. And that really helps to give you a lot of unique opportunities at the school. And one of the other things I think that's great about Stanford is that they really work with other departments, and they practice what they preach in terms of focusing on continuing to innovate themselves in the way that they teach. And I think that's also something that is really special to Stanford's culture, is that they have so many courses that are based on experiential learning. One of them is the famous ones is the Startup Garage, where you actually work with people from other schools. It doesn't have to just be MBA students, and you take an idea from start, where you come up with an idea for a business, and then you end up by presenting it to a panel of professors and venture capitalists. And these ideas often become real companies. There's been more than 100 companies now that have been founded just from this one class. And then another example of that synergy is there's a course called Design for Extreme Affordability, where Stanford Business School students are paired with Stanford engineers, and they're given a project such as water purification that's really important in the developing world. And they come up with a real world product that is going to solve that problem. And once again, these, when they're really good, they turn into real products that are available. And another example of that connection is big data and artificial intelligence, which is another area that Stanford is very focused on and believes that it is important for everyone to understand big data and AI, because it's just becoming important in so many aspects of our life these days. And they have a course that is co-taught with the Human Center for Artificial Intelligence, where it's a marketing professor and a professor from that department getting together to teach these business school students not just the business aspects, but also the underlying technology and sort of what the issues and implications of that are. So that just gives you a sense of all the variety of things that Stanford's access and connection to these other schools can give you.
Right. You talk about everything that's available on the other side of the street. I guess on the other coast, on the other side of the river, the Charles River in this case, somebody that works at Harvard Business School once shared that in the rare cases where Harvard and Stanford make an offer to the same individual in the last 10 to 12 years, Stanford was winning 3 out of every 4 of those head-to-heads. So clearly the culture of these two schools is also part of fit and sort of alignment, your hopes and dreams. So Tatiana, moving on to Stanford's culture, how would you describe it, and who do you think is a good fit for the school?
Yeah, definitely, Matt. And I would say that Stanford, I would describe it as a very good balance of polarities. And what I mean by this is that it's almost like a both and situation. You have incredibly self-driven individuals that seek success, they want to be successful, but at the same time, they are very good at collaborating. I mean, it's no surprise that I think 30 couples out of Rachel's and my class got married. I mean, what ultimate example of teamwork than marriage? And that really just extends to the whole experience. And so you have very self-driven individuals with an appetite for impact and an appetite for success. But by the same token, they need to develop, if they have not developed that level of awareness, to be able to integrate themselves into teams, into groups, and eventually realize that it's not your own doing as an individual that ultimately renders the impact, but it's working with others and working through others. Now, I don't know if this was by design, but it works beautifully that the class is so compact and so intimate, because you end up knowing people in almost every aspect of their lives. And so that brings about a level of intimacy and connection that allows for further and further interaction and further impact. I can say that during my 2 years at Stanford and ever since, it doesn't take long to immediately connect with any of my classmates and be able to tackle not only career things, or elements of professional life. You can talk about being a parent, you can talk about dealing with aging parents, you can talk about aging yourself, you can talk about pivoting your career, and you'll always find depth in the connection. And that's something that you can experience, as soon as you land on campus and you start connecting to your peers, and you keep experiencing that beyond years and beyond physical presence at the school. That I might say extends, because it's incredible how they build this DNA in the selection of individuals that are phenomenal as individuals, but then that are great in groups and, like in just, bigger bodies of individuals. But it's true for every class. So, like whenever I've moved or I've needed to connect to the Stanford chapter, wherever I am, I've always found it incredibly stimulating. That intellectual vitality that the school goes after, that's something that pertains in these individuals' lives, regardless of what class they are from. And so I would say it is a green field for growth. It's a green field for in-depth knowledge of oneself and others. And it's a place prone for genuine connection. And that genuine connection is so energizing. And then it just manifests on so many facets of, I insist, as professional life, personal life, different stages in life. So yeah, like I would say, hopefully I have been able to illustrate what's expected, during your time at Stanford, and then what remains for the years and years to come after graduation.
Right. Later in today's masterclass, we'll be looking at the interview. And I often think about the GSB interview in terms of what it's not. It's not this formal 30 minutes linear questions, talk about leadership. It can run for an hour and a half, 2 hours. I mean, you've done so many interviews yourselves, very curious. As the host, I get to talk about hearsay, and as the panelists, you are the experts that have really lived this. Somebody once put to me, Tatiana, that if you were at a cocktail party, maybe there would be a Wharton or a Columbia grad, and there would be a Stanford grad. And if you ask those two individuals, so, where do you see yourself 5, 10 years from now? And maybe the Wharton or Columbia grad would say, well, 5 years from now, I'd like to be vice president of this profit center. And it would be very, sort of professionally determined. And the Stanford grad might reply and say, well, I'm very worried about the quality of the Earth's water supply, or one of those big thorny problems that's do you feel that there's sort of an energy there that you've described, perhaps that curiosity as well, to really tackle some of the world's big problems?
I definitely, I sensed it when, like many years ago when I was physically at Stanford, and I think it has manifested through like just the tremendous impact that a lot of our classmates, have had in the different fields and venues of their professional existence. And so I do feel that that element of being driven individuals and also having this big appetite for impact, the combination of those two, in addition to the depth of the self-awareness, it brings about sense of purpose beyond the very specific ways in which you can measure success. So it's this drive to ultimately have an impact that might go beyond the, like the self-defined rules that by any culture measure success. And so I do, and of course, like it doesn't happen to every single one of the individuals that go to the Stanford class, but it's a very high percentage of individuals that, regardless of the field that they play in, or regardless of the role that they eventually, pursue, they can have tremendous impact on education. They can have tremendous impact on investment. They can have tremendous impact on almost any field that you can think of. And I think, again, it's the combination of having a big appetite for impact, having a sense of humility in terms of knowing that you don't have all the answers, but you can pivot and you can seek them and you can lean on others. And ultimately being very honest with oneself and knowing when you have satisfied your curiosity and you have satisfied your quest.
Right. Now, I suppose one common trait among the graduates is sort of academic vitality. The school enjoys the highest average GPA of any top MBA program, the highest GMAT average. In fact, when I sat down with Kirsten Moss at the NASDAQ Center, she'd been in her position as the admissions director at Stanford for 3 weeks. But Kirsten being Kirsten, and as outspoken and forthright as she is, she's an extraordinary individual. And she said, I think the Stanford's GMAT average is too high. At the time, it was 737. It's come down a few points since then, but I guess she was alluding to, the bigger picture. Nevertheless, Silpa, academics you are looking for that tremendous academic rigor. Talk to us a little bit about what the school's looking for.
Sure. So a key thing to keep in mind is it's a holistic process. It's a comprehensive evaluation approach, meaning no single category like academics is going to serve as the sole determining factor of an admissions decision. But as Matt had mentioned, the stats are strong. If you look at the class of 2022, the average undergrad GPA is 3.8. The average GMAT is 730. GRE, average verbal of 165, and an average quant of 164. So certainly those are some solid stats. But really the admissions committee at the GSB, they're looking to assess how someone would engage within the classroom. They want to determine whether an applicant can manage or ideally thrive in a really rigorous program like this. So one of the ways they assess this is they examine the applicant's intellectual curiosity. Is this person interested in seeking out new knowledge or expertise? Do they demonstrate the ability to develop or share new insights or new perspectives? Are they comfortable with challenging assumptions or tackling those really difficult problems? So to assess this intellectual curiosity and intellectual vitality, they look at two key pieces of data. The first is the transcript, and the second is the test scores, of course. So the transcript holds a lot of weight because it represents performance sustained over time. I mean, for most people, what is it? It's like a 4-year time frame of their performance. So the committee dives into, well, what university did you attend? What was your field of study? What kind of courses did you take? Is it a breadth of courses, or perhaps you dive really deep into one particular area of interest? And then how did you perform? So there's no preference for a particular university, state schools, private schools, Ivies, all good, or even a preference for a particular field of study, because majors ranging from liberal arts to engineering to business, all of these are equally valued and welcome for the diversity of perspectives that they bring to the class. So instead, the focus is on how applicants have challenged themselves and how well they performed. Because the admissions committee, they're aware that GPA varies by school and it varies by major. And they're also aware that not everybody has a smooth start when they first get to college and are away from home for the first time. So they look at the overall trend of the GPA. Even if it does start off rocky, does it ultimately trend upward? And if there is a semester or a period of time where you believe your grades don't reflect your capability, don't hesitate to mention that in the additional information essay to provide the context behind it. And this is also the place to mention any additional academic experience that isn't noted elsewhere in the application, like any independent research that you conducted, or pre-MBA courses you've taken, or quant boot camps that you've participated in, things of that sort. So that covers the transcript and the grades. Now the next key data point is the test scores. So there's no preference between the GMAT and the GRE, but the thing to keep in mind is that all of the section scores are important. The quant, the verbal, the analytical writing assessment, the inductive reasoning, because each of these sections will provide some insight on how someone might be able to manage specific parts of the MBA curriculum. So give yourself ample time to study or to retake the exam because you'll want those scores to reflect your academic ability. That being said, the admissions committee is aware that for a lot of people, test taking isn't really their strong suit. So if there is a particular score that ultimately you're not satisfied with, you can certainly highlight other areas that demonstrate your proficiency in that section, such as work experience or undergrad coursework, or perhaps graduate coursework if applicable. If you didn't score as high as you'd like on the quant, but you work in the numbers-driven role or quant-based field, mention that in the additional information essay. Or perhaps if you didn't score as well as you would have liked on verbal or the analytical writing assessment, but you've excelled in a variety of English or comp lit or liberal arts courses. Certainly call that out in the additional information essay, because as we've discussed, it is a holistic approach and there are many data points. And the GSB has admitted students with a wide range of test scores, but the committee will look at this data point to determine a candidate's ability to manage the rigors of the program. So of course, the best approach is to simply prepare thoroughly and prepare well in advance to try to earn a score that you feel accurately represents that academic ability.
One of our viewers, Silpa, has written in and said, well, can a strong test score then compensate a lower GPA? I suppose taking that question, he described nosebleeding data points for those two, and you shared, just how high they are. And I suppose as you look at the diversity and the inclusion that is at the core of Stanford GSB, it could mean that so many people opt out and say, oh, well, I'm not even close to those scores. You know, it's just not going to happen for me. So perhaps, you know, you've sort of talked about a holistic process, and realistically, if people are cynical and saying, not even going to look at the school unless my GPA is in that range, just how would you reassure them and say, no, there is something, I mean, change lives, change the world. Look at what you've done. This is what's going to excite the admissions committee.
Yeah, Matt, yeah, that's the unfortunate part of it, is that many people perhaps are daunted by these stats and they do opt out. And that truly is unfortunate, because this is but one component. As I've said, there's many data points, and there's no single piece that's going to serve as like the final, you know, factor to consider whether somebody gets in or not. So if there is a weak test score or a weak GPA relative to the pool, there's other factors to consider. There's impact, there's leadership, there's the professional experience, there's other ways that one could demonstrate their intellectual curiosity and intellectual vitality even. For example, tackling those thorny world problems, as you've alluded to. So it's, you know, the whole admissions committee does, you know, when they meet with these admitted students, sometimes the admitted students will confide and say, you know, I was almost going to not apply to the GSB. Because I had spoken with someone at work, or I'd spoken with someone else, and they told me, oh yeah, well, their average GPA is this much, or their average test scores for that, and you don't quite have that. And truly, it's a good thing that those people didn't listen, because that class, what they're trying to build a diversity of perspectives, and everybody has their own diverse set of strengths and story. And there isn't, you know, one key metric that should decide or inform whether or not you do apply. Because truly, you know, people spike, right? There's strengths and there's weaknesses, and there's no such thing as a perfect applicant, or there's no such thing as a typical one even. So it's a good thing to consider that everything is holistic, everything is rounded and comprehensive.
Right. I suppose this is the moment for that Wayne Gretzky quote, isn't it? But certainly something that is true is that 100% of those admitted applied to the school, and you know, throwing your hat in the ring, and you know, beyond academics, of course, the professional trajectory and story that you have to share. Perhaps it's tempting to think, Rachel, well, unless I'd worked at this firm or I achieved this position within the first 2 years, again, this isn't going to happen for me. But such an eclectic mix, as you witnessed with your classmates.
Yes, so let me just kind of take you first through the demographics of the business school class so that people get a sense for what different backgrounds are represented. It's not a surprise, but a large percentage of the class does come from consulting. In some research that Fortuna has done, it's approximately 27% of the class that comes from consulting. But one thing that's interesting to think about is that maybe 18% of that, or 18% of the class, is people who worked directly in consulting and came right after that. But the rest of those consultants actually went and did something else after their initial experience, and may have experience in a completely different industry. And one thing that is also helpful for applicants to know is that if you are a consultant, consultants are sometimes on the younger end of the class. So if you are someone who is a consultant and you look at the average work experience that you see at these business schools and you go, oh, you know, I'm not quite there yet, that's not something that you necessarily need to worry about. It's really, once again, back to what Silpa was saying about the holistic experience. If you are someone who feels like you have already gotten the quality of experience you need to be a strong candidate, that is much more important than the number of years that you have worked. And you will find people from consulting and from a lot of other backgrounds that do have that experience in perhaps less than the average time that Stanford, you know, the average number of years that a Stanford applicant has worked. Another area that is obviously does send a lot of people to business school is finance. And finance at Stanford is approximately 20% of the class. And of that, about half of the financial services it admits come from private equity. But one thing when you're looking at finance to keep in mind if you're applying from that industry is that for some industries like consulting or other professions, they are, the admissions committee sees people moving from industry to industry and having experience that's pretty varied. And in finance, that is not necessarily the case. A lot of people who work in finance have stayed in finance for their entire pre-business school career, and may even be expecting to return to finance after they graduate from business school. And that's a very common profile. And so once again, if you're somebody who has just worked in one industry and you're thinking, ooh, do I need to get another job and another type of experience in order to make myself more attractive to the admissions committee, you should understand that the admissions committee sees different profiles, different career trajectories, and they know that some industries have a more linear career trajectory than others, and they're completely okay with all of those. So, once again, this is applicable to more than just the finance industry. If you are someone who has not changed and has stayed in your industry the whole time, that is great. It's about what you did in that industry. Just to give a little bit of another sense for what some of the other areas of the class are, entrepreneurs are about 6% of the class. This is people who actually identify as a founder or a CEO themselves, but less than half of those are in technology, which once again goes back to my earlier point that Stanford is really not a school for people who are just for people who are interested in technology. It has, it at its core, it is a general management program. It happens to have a lot of connections with people in technology, but anybody who is from any background can really thrive there. Technology is about 17% of the class. And that's split between the big companies that you've all heard of, and then a lot of smaller technology companies. And then that still leaves about a third of the class that comes from all sorts of other different industries. And some examples would be Adidas, the company Blue Apron, someone who worked at a county hospital, Johnson & Johnson, someone who worked at the NBA, Tokyo Electric Power Company, or even the White House. So you can see there's this huge range of companies represented in a typical class, and it's going to be different from year to year. And then also when you look at jobs and job titles, you get everything from a private equity investor to an advertising account manager to a chemical engineer to a teacher or a lawyer. There is not one background. There are certainly some backgrounds and some roles that send a fair number of people to business school, but it is equally important that the school have these other people that bring these different perspectives. And related to that is an important point that business experience is not actually what is required to go to business school. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but you can be someone who has never taken an economics class and never worked at a company in the sense that we normally think of it, and you can still be a fantastic candidate for business school. What is important is that you have shown your leadership in the role that you have, and that you have demonstrated your intellectual capability and how you have applied it professionally. So for example, let's say you're an engineer and you've never done anything with business, but you have worked to manage an extremely complex project where you're dealing with a very difficult client and the interpersonal dynamics on your team are super challenging, but you managed to resolve them somehow. And there are tons of technical roadblocks that you come across, and you have to come up with really creative solutions in order to solve them. Like, that's someone who has nothing to do with business, but could be a fantastic candidate for Stanford Business School. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And then back again, once again, to what Tatiana was saying, is the one thing that I will say that these students do have in common is that they are people who challenge themselves, and they are people who are striving continually to make an impact, and making an impact in demanding environments and demanding situations, no matter what they are. And that's really the common thread that you see in the class.
You mentioned, Rachel, the deep dive analysis that we did last year to look at where people studied and what they studied. We wanted to go beyond the class profile that Stanford and other top schools publish every year. But it was fascinating to look at the professional trajectories and what you're describing. I think in financial services, the number of people maybe that did those first 2 years of investment banking, and when the third year starts to look a lot like the second year. They made a switch, and whether they moved into PE, others joined the Gates Foundation. It was very, very eclectic in terms of what they did. Silpa mentioned for the transcript, the idea of, maybe you got off to a rocky start, but then, you hit your stride academically, or did you stretch yourself and take a course that wouldn't have been easy? Do you think, Rachel, that same template applies here to look at, you talk about impact, but how someone has stretched themselves, maybe taken a risk in their professional career?
Absolutely. So you might see someone, for example, that started off in a consulting firm and then went to a startup. And it's possible that that startup completely failed, or maybe they were even the founder of the company and it failed. But Stanford recognizes that that failure and that ability to take those risks and that willingness to take those risks is actually the mindset that you need to be successful long-term in business. So if you were somebody who has never succeeded at anything, that's probably not what's going to get you into business school. But if you have done challenging things, and some of them you have been really successful at, and then others maybe haven't worked out or you haven't been successful, or even when you started your job, you were really rocky at first and you didn't get how to do it, but then over time you moved from being perhaps one of the weaker performers in a class or in a group of analysts to being one of the strongest performers. That, once again, that shows exactly what Stanford is looking for. And sometimes it's actually more impressive than somebody who's just been handed everything on a silver platter and walked through their life, that you're actually able to deal when something isn't great, because everyone has challenges in your professional life and over the course of your career. It is never smooth sailing at all points, and you have to be able to deal with that. And Stanford is looking for that actively.
Right, so we're not resting on our laurels. We've looked at academics, we've looked at professional, but of course those are just two elements, and they don't, work doesn't define us. There are the other passions and areas of interest that we have at a school that has so many clubs and opportunities to express and explore those different passions. So extracurriculars, Tatiana, and I don't know if this fits in with changing the world, but what are the sort of things, and even how that illustrates certain behaviors that they've seen in your academics, in your professional, and then again will evidence in the things that you've done outside of work in your extracurricular community interest?
Definitely. And Matt, I think for these, it's important to keep in mind that I think a very important premise from the admissions committee is that behaviors that you have displayed in the past are the best predictors of what's coming down the line. And so, of course, they're interested in finding that academic stamina that Silpa was talking about. But then woven into that is that intellectual vitality that can pertain to the academic field, or it can go beyond. And so there is exactly where extracurriculars fit in. And in terms of activities that you do beyond what's expected of you academically, it has to have a touch of it being genuine. It doesn't have to be something in which you are adding a long inventory of things that sound catchy or are glamorous or are just trendy, but something that you're truly interested and invested into, and that you're not just doing for doing, that you're seeking an impact. Doesn't matter the heft of the impact, but that there's a reasoning, there is a logic as to why you're choosing to do what you're doing on your free time. Why is it meaningful to you? And then ultimately, what are you seeking with that? It may very well be anything connected to social impact, or any other field. The extracurriculars are really not limited by theme or by topic. It has to be something that has relevance and that has meaning to you. And ideally, like in tackling that, what matters most to you and why, regardless of what sphere of life you are pursuing things in, if you can thread a common theme, if you can find the things that truly motivate you and ignite you, and manifest that in a more formal setting, as it could be the academic or the professional, or beyond, just seeking that impact beyond the expected places, those are the elements that are interesting and appetizing from an admissions committee perspective. So again, echoing what Rachel was saying in terms of there being no specific profile. Yeah, you can always gather the stats. You can always come up with, what are the most mentioned extracurriculars. In the end, what's being sought is to enrich the diversity of the class. It's making sure that you have individuals that have common traits in terms of their commitment and their responsibility and their impact. But having said that, they come from such a diverse pool of backgrounds that can be manifested through the specifics of the professional life or the academics or the extracurriculars. And so it's in that wealth of experience and exposure and deliberate purpose that then they can amass these amazing classes that ultimately have impact while they're together in campus and then, beyond in life. So no specific recipe. I guess it's more the clarity of having purpose, having meaning, not doing things just for doing them, and ultimately having a way to communicate the impact that is being sought through any individual action.
I guess with the success of The Queen's Gambit on Netflix, we'll have a lot more chess players, or at least people describing a passion for chess. Tatiana, when Kirsten, we talked about the new role that she was going to take on at Stanford, so this goes back 4 years, and she said, yeah, in the first year, Matt, I'm going to read all of the essays, what matters most to you. And I was like, oh, Kirsten, that's over 8,000 essays. Isn't there like a good Margaret Atwood book or something else that you could read? But being Kirsten, she did read all of them. And a year later, when we did an event, she said, I get it. You're all smart. You're all enjoying these fast-track professional careers. But you start to talk to us about how after Stanford, you're going to eradicate poverty. You're going to, urban pollution, whatever it might be. Don't forget that we look through your background, your resume, all of the details that you've shared. And if we don't see environmental activism or sort of social, economic injustice that you've been fighting for, it suddenly looks very hollow. So, you talked about the authenticity of those extracurriculars. You need to be able to demonstrate that to be able to feed into the bigger narrative you might then be sharing with Kirsten and her colleagues.
And that's definitely this common thread that I was talking about in terms of if you cannot address either one of the essays superficially and still make the click and the connection with every other element of the application. So it's in gaining that awareness of knowing what makes you tick and what motivates you, and then in congruence with that, in alignment with that, then crafting, in a very natural and organic manner, what are the things that you are seeking with purpose, with meaning, so that it doesn't feel like it's a quilt, of different interests or a quilt of different motivations, and then the vision and the ambition of what I'm going to be seeking once I graduate. It is finding that common thread, that backbone that has consciously or unconsciously guided your decisions up to the point in which you are now, and digging in deep, it's unearthing what have been the role models, the impactful moments in your life, all the myriad of elements that have made you who you are. And that's, I guess, what eventually is being covered with what matters most to you, and then what's to come, which is, and so why are you seeking an MBA? This is costly both in financial terms and in time, but you have to be seeking something that's going to give you a better return by doing this. And in doing so, also tell us a little bit more about yourself. And so what is it that you do with your free time? What are the things, are you just filling out time, or is there a sense of purpose? And all of these I mentioned because ultimately, if you have demonstrated in the past that you have that capacity for in-depth self-awareness and for a sense of purpose and action, it's very possible that you're going to keep doing that as you age and as you progress and you mature in your career. And that's exactly, I think, what the school is going after, because they're not just having you for 2 years, they have you for the rest of your life in terms of the impact and, you know, the series of actions and decisions that you're going to keep making as you progress. And so in that saying, Matt, is that there has to be coherence, and hopefully that coherence, it's not something that is being fabricated to, you know, like just present oneself in under a desirable light, but that there is a sense of awareness and there's a sense of action reaction, you know, in one's life that you can communicate to the admissions committee.
Tatiana, you've created this wonderful transition for us moving to talk about the essays, but just before we go there, Silpa, I'd like to turn to you and reflect on, I guess, among the M7 schools, it's typically the youngest MBA class on average, 26 and a half, 27. And some of the viewers are asking about, well, what if I'm in my mid-30s? We're talking about the full-time MBA program, but there is this other hidden gem, or this extraordinary program at Stanford called MSX. It used to be called Sloan. It all became very confusing with too many Sloan programs at different schools, but Stanford MSX, which is intended for a slightly more senior group, but I think everything that you, Rachel, and Tatiana have shared still apply. Can you just talk to us briefly about the MSX and perhaps, you know, at what point that might be the right program to target?
Sure. So Matt, as you mentioned, it is an accelerated program. So it is the 1 year. So so everything we've discussed still applies certainly, but the real focus here is really have that clarity of purpose, because you enter the full 2 years, you'll have a 1 year in the program. So have a very clear idea of the impact that you want to have and what you plan to, how you plan to use this program to poise yourself for that next step in your career. So of course, with the everything from your experience to your reference letters to everything, it should just, everything else in your app, really it should highlight your managerial performance, your executive potential, your impact, things of that sort. And then the academic piece, of course, still looking to see if you can manage the rigors of that program, of this program. And for the essays and that purpose and those passions, really, they should be locked and clear and very, I guess, unambiguous in your purpose, because given that there is only a year in this program, they're really looking for somebody with that insight and that depth in terms of what it is they'd like to achieve and how they plan to use the M6 program in order to get there.
Right. And I believe that you can, in applying to the full-time MBA program, you can indicate the interest for the MSX, and the application that similarly includes what we're now going to discuss, this iconic essay that Stanford has asked now for over 18 years. What matters most to you and why? Perhaps a smile on Rachel and Tatiana's faces as they think of tackling that question a few years ago. The top essay tips, and Silpa, if I can stay with you, because I guess with 3 voices, 3 perspectives on this, what you really see, and with all of the applications that you read at your time at the GSB, you know, what sort of struck you and advice that you would share with our viewers?
Sure. So my tip here is for, well, for both essays really, just self-reflect and tell your story in an authentic way. So self-reflect and determine what shaped you, what inspires you, what drives you. Really think about your values, your passions, your experiences, your aspirations in order to communicate your unique story. This is like for the what matters most, this is a really good opportunity. It's a really neat essay topic. So it's a really good opportunity to convey who you are rather than strictly focusing on what you've accomplished. There's no need to restate your resume here because other parts of your application already do that. They already highlight your academics and your professional impact. So a really powerful what matters most demonstrates your other dimensions, like your character, your beliefs, your identity, your passions, your purpose. It provides a really clear view of how your background shaped your journey thus far, and how it influences the impact that you'll make within the program, as well as in your broader communities. And the same advice applies for, the MBA or those more seasoned applicants for the M6, is really having that insight and depth of awareness and that understanding of purpose and what drives you here. And for the, are we covering why Stanford or just what matters most at this point?
Our ambition is to
Covering it all?
everything.
Okay.
The viewers would love to hear from the three of you.
Okay, so for the why Stanford, similarly, that self-reflection, just look inward and also do your research. So you'll want to convey real clarity in your professional goals, and you'll want to be able to articulate how the GSB experience is going to help you attain these goals. So just really have a clear idea of why this is the right time for you to be pursuing an MBA, and why Stanford is the best place for you to do that. So understand how you hope to learn and grow from the MBA experience, as well as the unique perspective that you'd be bringing to the class, and understand how and convey how the program is going to prepare you for the next phase in your career. So in a nutshell, my tips, if you will, for both essays is just really take some time to be introspective and convey what you're all about.
Right, and with that emphasis, Silpa, on values, a belief system. I'm perhaps would include discussion of golden retrievers and Venezuelan dark chocolate. If I was to reapply to the program, and it's one of the questions from our viewers, those fundamentals may not have changed. So it's not then reapplying and saying, oh, I need something else that matters more to me because the first time it didn't work. And any advice just for reapplying and thinking about those essays?
That's a fantastic point, because something so deep to the core of you, what matters most? No, you wouldn't have expect that would change from year to year even. So for the reapplicants, certainly it's okay, and it's expected to, for what matters most anyway, for that to be fairly consistent. For the reapplicants, if they wanted to highlight what might have changed, I would suggest using the additional information essay for that, in fact, or perhaps some of the optional impacts for recent impacts that they've had. Something that's core to you, your belief system or your values, or an essay that really just speaks to who you are. It's okay to not revamp that. In fact, I don't think it would be expected to, for that matter. And for why Stanford, similarly, convey that clarity of purpose, convey that those goals, and how this would be the best fit. So yeah, that's a great question. It absolutely doesn't need to reshape or revamp these particular essays if that part of you has not changed, which in most cases I'd imagine that it might not have.
Rachel, you've successfully worked with applicants to Stanford. Great questions, wrestling with them, but the sort of introspection that it encourages or enables you to embrace. What would be your advice or the tips that you would share?
So I'd say one thing is to be ruthless in your editing and in your revisions. People will often write a draft of their essays, and there'll be a story in it, and the story is a really good story, and it says something great about them. But it may end up, once you go through a certain number of revisions, not actually fitting and not actually working with the theme and the central message that you're trying to convey in the essay. And it's incredible if you take that story out. It just happens over and over again. You find a different story that works better, and it just clicks. Like, if something is not working, don't keep trying to make it work. Find something else, and I promise you there will be something else. There isn't one way to write this essay. There isn't one story to focus on. You should be willing to constantly re-revise, and even the most important sacred cows, throw them out if they're not working. And I think it's also important to really focus on, to focus the essay on, as Silpa said, your beliefs and your core thing. But one of the things there to keep in mind is that there is going to be a consistent message. There is always a through line because you are you. And so you may have done 20 different things in your life that seem really, really different, but there's a reason why you did those 20 different things that are very different. And that is part of who you are. And so make sure to tell that story.
And I guess, Tatiana, when we approach the essay, the school already has your resume and all of the bullet points that detail the professional trajectory that you've enjoyed. They've heard from recommenders and the insights that they've been able to share. So this is actually an opportunity to share a far more personal story.
Absolutely. And, as far as tips go, the way that I love to tackle these essays is first to think that what matters most to you and why is a reflection of your past and your present. And then the why Stanford, why now, it's more a projection of the future. And so actually the work that goes before actually sitting down and starting to write down the essay, I really, truly enjoy doing that work with applicants because normally I just push them to sit down and draw a timeline and identify different moments, instances in their existence and different role models and different situations, anecdotes that come to the surface of their minds when they are trying to think of when they were in childhood and later in life. And so based off of that, it just gives us a richness of examples and of instances that then we can weave into the story. Ultimately, what we want is for the reader of that essay to put the essay down and say, what a wonderful experience. It was not only giving me this great content, I know more about this individual, even though I have not met this person. But it gives me a flavor of the things that I cannot catch through a resume or a GPA or a GMAT score. It tells me what makes this individual tick, their motivations, their aspirations, their fears, like all those things that make you human. And so if you can communicate that in a way that it's truly an experience, it's joyful to read that essay, then when the person finishes reading that, they say, I must talk to this individual. We must invite them for an interview. And it's not only someone telling me, what has made them who they are now, but it's also telling me what are their dreams, what are they going to go for? And more importantly, in a very humble manner, where do they see gaps in their growth, in their approach to life? And so there is where maybe those gaps can be, shortened or enhanced, like through instruction at Stanford or through the experience at Stanford. And so that all together makes for a very coherent, genuine, authentic, deep felt story and approach from the candidate. And so I like to generally approach those two essays as if they were one continuous thread in which you could just read them. Of course, you need to separate them and be careful with the word count and all of that. But that by the end of reading those two essays, I know so much more about who you are and about things that only by you being vulnerable and opening up, I have had access to those pieces of information.
And thank you for introducing the word joyful. Maybe Kirsten didn't need that Margaret Atwood novel at all. She had 8,000 wonderful personal stories. There are two other voices that also are a key part of the application, recommenders. And Silpa, you're going to talk through perhaps who to choose. And there's another great Fortuna webinar just looking at that as a recommendation that I encourage our viewers to find on our YouTube channel. But for the GSB, what are they really looking to gain from those two voices?
Sure. So the letters of reference, this is a critical part of the application because as Tatiana had mentioned earlier, past behavior is seen as predictive of future behavior. And this is a rare opportunity to see an applicant from someone else's perspective, because if you think about it, everything else the applicant submits the essays, the resume, the application, that's all just something that their eyes have seen and they submit. Here's a unique opportunity to get someone else's perspective on you. So applicants will be asked to submit 2 letters of reference. One will be from a current direct supervisor, or the next best alternative if you happen to be self-employed or work for a family member or just start a new job, or if your supervisor doesn't know you're applying. And the second one will be someone else who has supervised your work. It's best to choose someone who really knows your work and can speak to not only just what you did, but how you did it. So don't worry about their title, don't worry about their background or their alumni status or even their writing skills, really. You certainly don't need to seek out the CEO or the CFO of your org, or there's a misconception that it's better to seek out a Stanford alum. But honestly, if these people aren't able to provide a very detailed account of your impact, you're better off choosing someone else. So choose someone who has known you well and has had significant and direct involvement with you within the past few years, something recent. Best to choose someone who can write thoughtfully about your impact and provide really detailed examples and really detailed anecdotes to substantiate the statements that they're making. It's best to choose someone who demonstrates eagerness to really spend time writing a thoughtful and enthusiastic letter on your behalf. Really powerful, really strong letters of reference will include specific stories and examples about your behaviors or your working style, your personal qualities, and your impact, rather than just listing a bunch of superlatives or positive adjectives of praise. They're going to go beyond what you've accomplished, and they'll also cover how you've accomplished it. So you can select a reference from your professional, your community, or your extracurricular experiences, but oftentimes you can get some really strong references coming from the workplace. And it's totally okay to have 2 references from the same organization. I think the important thing to keep in mind here is to just choose the people who can best represent your aptitude and best represent your potential impact.
Right. As a school, and having read many letters of reference, Silpa, they don't need to be Pulitzer Prize-winning authors. You know, it can be a turgid, very sort of direct field engineer working in oil and gas. You're able to sort of place that context and culture to understand the underlying messages that they're sharing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, the writing style, it's not important to choose someone with the best writing style or the most clear. It's really the admissions committee can suss out impact regardless of whether you have Pulitzer Prize level writing or just somebody who's able to provide a detailed account of leadership or impact or contributions, really. So that's a really great point, and it's not something that needs to be sought out, certainly.
Right. So we go from 18 or 19 applicants for one place in the program. In fact, this year that number I suspect will be well over 20 applicants for one place. And then the great news that you've been invited for interview. And of course, Rachel, Tatiana, you've conducted many of the interviews for the school. So suddenly the chances have improved dramatically. Maybe it's even as good as 1 in 2 at this point, and making sure that that you shine. I love the fact, Rachel, that you've said in the past, you always would ask the question again if you felt that it would help the candidate. So talk us through the alumni interview that's at the heart of the GSB application, what to expect.
Sure. So first of all, if you do get an interview, you should congratulate yourself. It's really a testament to the application you put together, but most importantly, the work that you did up to that point that made it such an impressive application. The Stanford interview is a behavioral interview. It is officially 45 to 60 minutes, but you can be prepared for it to go up to about 90 minutes. And a behavioral interview means that you are going to be asked a series of questions that begin with something like, tell me about a time when. And then you'll be asked a lot of detailed follow-up questions that really probe exactly what happened, what your role was, how it happened, and trying to get a just much deeper picture of these incidents. And don't be surprised if you only talk about a couple of examples in a behavioral interview. That can actually be pretty common. Especially if they really go in depth on that story. You should also remember though that different people at Stanford do have different interview styles. So sometimes you get the classic behavioral interview, but you might get an interviewer who is a little bit different and spends more time on the more standard questions, like talk me through your resume, or walk me through your resume, or tell me about what your long-term goals are. So just go with the flow and be prepared to sort of just answer whatever questions they ask. There's not one interview that you should get and that you should be worried if for some reason you don't get that interview. So how you should prepare for the interview, I think the most important thing to do first is that if you get invited to interview, you should pull out your application, every single piece of it, and review it thoroughly, because it's probably been about a month or more since you submitted it, and you want to make sure that you're very familiar with everything in it. And then what you need to do is think about stories and examples, primarily in your professional experience, where you really have made a contribution to that community, either your professional community or an extracurricular or volunteer community that you're involved in. And what was that impact, and how did you do that? And prepare several different examples that highlight different attributes of yours that you think are important. And then I would say, do a mock interview with someone. You can have a friend do a mock interview by Googling on the web what behavioral questions are, or you can ask Fortuna or a professional coach to do a mock interview with you. And this, first of all, just helps you get practice and experience with this format. And also at the end of it, you can talk about what worked and what didn't work. Were there some stories or examples that you gave that were really impressive, and maybe some that weren't so great, your communication style, etc. And then finally, one thing to try and keep in mind when you're going through this interview is that it is just one piece of the puzzle. It is not, I think sometimes people think that you get to the interview and then they just admit the people who had the best interviews. And it's not like that at all. It is a holistic process. I know we keep saying that, but it's very true. And the interview is just one more aspect of who you are that they put into your application to then review and see how it fills out the rest of the application. So try to relax and not worry too much about the interview. If you got an interview, you probably have already done a lot of great things and you're gonna do a great job in it.
In terms of that preparation, Rachel, any interview, as the interviewee, you're receiving the majority of the questions, but it is still a conversation. Perhaps finding out who you're interviewing with, having your listening skills switched on to find out, how they like to exchange. Do they clearly like shorter answers, or happy for you to sort of, how would you sort of place it in the context of who might be in front of you?
Sure, I think it's very helpful to know a little bit about your interviewer. I would say that in terms of your discussion with them, if it's something that's on their LinkedIn profile, it's probably okay to bring up. But you shouldn't reveal lots of details about them if you Googled them or found out information about them. And it is very much a conversation, but it should, in the first part, be a conversation about you, if that makes sense. And you should be able to present yourself authentically, no matter who your interviewer is. And then in the latter part, where you get to ask the interviewer questions, that's where the interviewer's background and experience may actually become more relevant, and you can ask about that directly.
Tatiana, we've given so many great examples of what to do. So my final question to you is perhaps what not to do. Even as we think about, enjoy this opportunity, but some of maybe the pitfalls, the mistakes that you've seen, and being able to sort of catch. What would your advice be in terms of what not to do as you approach the application to the GSB?
Absolutely, and I think, Matt, I would completely start with, don't succumb to the idea that there is a set profile, or that there is a stereotype, that there's a mold that you need to transform yourself and fit into that. Completely disregard that idea, and then center yourself and truly ground yourself into the thought that the school really wants to know who you are. What's your character? What are you made of? What propels you into action? So instead of it being a quest of trying to find the answers outside of yourself, it has to be a very personal quest of completely diving deep into who you are, and then opening up yourself in a vulnerable and authentic way, like in how you're going to present yourself to the admissions committee. So first off, forget about falling into that pitfall of I need to fit into someone else's mold. This is all about you being true and presenting yourself with the depth of that awareness. And then secondly, don't succumb to the temptation of making it transactional, make it very relational, just touching upon, for instance, the interview. Make sure you're the expert of who you are, and you're the expert of what has made you. You just need to quiet your mind down and try to conquer your fears and be ruthless and unapologetic about finding that voice. And in doing that, make sure that you're trying to establish a connection with whoever is on the other end of reading that essay, whoever is going to be sitting in front of you in person or through Zoom, and make sure that you're not doing those interactions in an automatic manner or in a prescriptive manner. Make sure that you're doing every single one of those interactions, it being through essay or interview, or make it purposeful and make it with the interest of cementing a connection. So overall, just forget about trying to find the answer outside, try to find the answer inside, and be very deliberate and purposeful with every one of your interactions.
Right. As I reflect on some of the different statements that each of the three of you have made about you are you, or sort of looking inside to then share your story, and the confidence, I think each of you have given people the confidence to say, no, this is your story. So I guess that means that there are no wrong answers because it's your story. We've got time just for 2 or 3 of the questions, and I'm going to bring together from Antonio and Midavi a couple of questions that we had around recommendations. So Silpa, I'll go back to you for these in terms of either asking an academic supervisor or a cousin, I guess a family member, and would that be considered too biased? Or the final example was perhaps the period of time with which you might have been working with that recommender. In this case, Stanish has been working with them just over a couple of months, but very intensely. So between the academic, the family member, and even if there's at least an extended period of time you would want to see to give depth, I guess, to that recommendation.
Sure. So the academic, for this, now it's certainly been done, and in some cases it's done very well. But for the academic, as long as you're sure that they can really speak to your impact and not really impact within the class. I mean, it's one thing to say, this applicant, is engaged in class discussions, has a lot of insightful points. You'll really want somebody who can highlight, call out your impact. So if you feel like this is the academic recommendation is one that can do that. For example, if there are a lot of other extracurriculars or clubs or involvement for which this academic professor or advisor is aware of your impact and aware of your contributions, then that certainly might provide a strong one. But it wouldn't quite be so compelling if the academic recommender just talked about how you earned the top score in this course, or you're engaged in discussion and just mentioned a lot of praise. Really, we want detail, or Stanford's looking for detailed examples of impact, not just positive adjectives, right? So it would completely depend on the nature of that relationship and that interaction. Yeah. For the family member, I think it would be best, if possible, to select someone else, for example, somebody on the board or perhaps a client, because there might be that that bias or that perception of bias for a family member, if that's who you happen to report to, if you work for a family member, if you work for a business or you report to a family member, you know, could be helpful to look elsewhere and look at clients or somebody on the board or customers or things of that nature.
Right.
And the last question being the duration of time at which you worked with this person or for this person. If it is recent and it is intense and you've made a lot of impact and they're privy to all the impact you've made in those past few months, by all means, it could be fair game. But really, my tip would just be to really look at your professional history and your track record and ask yourself, is this the best person who can speak to my contributions, my effect, my impact that I've made throughout my career? Is this the person who could provide the most compelling account of it and the most detailed account where they can talk to specific examples and specific ways in which I went about my job and was able to be successful and drive impact and drive change? So in that sense, there's no, it's certainly feasible. And the other thing to note is it should be fairly recent. If it's someone you had a few intense months working with, but it was 7 years ago, that, you know, you see that's more than bordering on a little bit stale. So hopefully something in the more recent history.
Right. Rachel, for you, a viewer has asked, you know, is there an upper limit on the number of jobs that you can have before applying to Stanford? And I don't think that they mean the morning newspapers I used to deliver when I was 11 years old. And I'll add to that gaps, you know, that even perhaps during the pandemic, that, you know, given certain industries, how hard they've been hit. But do you think that there's an upper limit on the number of jobs? Does that create a confusing mosaic?
So I think if it's post college graduation, then you do need to include everything that was substantial. If it was a 2-month internship that you had the summer after college, you don't have to include it. But Stanford, to your question about gaps, specifically asks, I think, if there's been a gap of more than 4 months in your work experience. So they want to see that continuity. And if you do have a gap, there's a place in the application to explain it, and then you can also use the additional information question to explain it. And in terms of while you're in college, Stanford allows you to list all of those jobs. And once again, if it's something that you think was valid and valuable and significant, then you should include it. And if it's something that was really not significant or meaningful at all, and where you didn't really gain any relevant experience, then no, you can just leave it off of the application.
I presume that creates too much clutter and noise and dilutes from the key messages that you want to share.
You know, a lot of people in college do have 3 or 4 different jobs that they've had. That's totally fine to include all of them, as long as all of them have something at least that shows the qualities that Stanford is looking for, and, you know, shows that you weren't just filing, you were doing something above and beyond that.
Right. So the final question, as we reach, you know, a pandemic, its impact on international travel and consequently international applicants' visa difficulties, so many different, and yet Stanford was able to maintain, Tatiana, pretty much the level of international intake. Other M7 schools saw a significant decline. Just perhaps a few final thoughts for you. International students, anything different in the way that they might apply to the school? Maybe they haven't had a chance for a campus visit, but anything to bear in mind for an international applicant?
I think in terms of the basics of what we have covered during this panel, I think the basics apply, either it being a domestic applicant or an international applicant. Having been an international applicant myself, an international alum, my recommendation would be to get as versed into the school dynamics and the culture, and to get as versed as possible, because it's very difficult to extrapolate from one's own experience, you know, in our home country, to extrapolate that to how things come to be, you know, in in the US in general, and then in particular in the case of Stanford. So there might be a little more legwork that needs to be done by international students in terms of understanding what's the school about, what makes it different from other schools, and then general guidelines, that might be different from what, like the experience back in any applicant's hometown. So it's doing that extra work or that stretch in terms of having a better visual or knowing what to expect. If it cannot be done, just as you mentioned, because of travel restrictions and the pandemic, it cannot be done through an in-person visit. Talk to alums, talk to individuals that have experienced the school, and try to gather and form an impression from those interactions.
There are a couple of iconic statements, phrases people associate with the school. Of course, this essay, What Matters Most to You, change lives, change organizations, change the world. I would like to add another one, because in all of my interactions with the staff at Stanford, with faculty, with students, and with alumni, so many of them, when I speak with them, one of the first things that they always say to me is, how can I help you? Now that question is fundamentally different from somebody that asks, what do you want? And I think it speaks to our three panelists this evening who have gone out of their way to think about how they could help you in your personal journey, applying to Stanford GSB and perhaps other top business schools. So Rachel, Silpa, Tatiana, thank you for thinking about how you could help our viewers with this webinar. We did say and encourage you to reach out to Fortuna to share your story, your next steps, and gain the sort of insider insights and expertise that I think all of you have witnessed in the last 70 minutes of this webinar. So thank you for joining us for today's Tuesday Masterclass. And of course, more to come next Tuesday as we work through the rest of the M7 schools, INSEAD, London Business School, and then the MS7. Beyond that, thanks for a great session, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.